The eyeballs sat on the top of an old stump looking in the direction from which they had approached like some incredibly gross cartoon version of O.L. Stumpy. A stubborn old stump that had a set of human eyeballs to see what was going on in the world. The problem with all that was those eyes were the same color as the eyes of their guide who had brought them out into the wilderness. The father and son called for him but they got no reply. The campsite was a mess and the air stunk from a slight musky, soured swampy scent which was offensive to the nose. 2 days ago in the early fall of 1978, Chester and Sean Collingsworth had arrived in a location best described as just outside of British Columbia, where they met their guide Cheddar. He took them north to the area around Watson Lake. They planned on doing some fishing for the next couple weeks. Armed with plenty of bug spray, bait, food and booze, they had all a father and son needed to have a great 2-week vacation in the back country of Canada. That included bringing a hunting rifle which was there for bear protection. It was a warm day and the 2 vacationers had slept through the worst of it taking a nap. Then their guide took them out to do some late afternoon fishing while Cheddar returned to fix supper. He had left the father-son duo about 90 minutes ahead so he would have dinner ready when they got back. Upon arriving back at their camp they could see something was wrong immediately. The camp was strung around. There were clothes. Sleeping bags. Several pairs of socks which the men quickly rescued and put away into one of the packs they were able to find. They also found something which was very unsettling. Their guide was not there but his eyes were watching them. Needless to say both father and son were terrified. Something had killed their guide and left only his eyes. It was unbelievably horrible. What was worse was that they were quickly coming upon another night. There was no choice but to plan on camping there until morning. To go bolting out into the darkness would accomplish nothing positive. No, they were going to have camp there for the night. Staying together they scavenged around for all the dry firewood they could gather. Canada nights could get cold even in the summertime but this was not why they wanted so much firewood. They wanted protection. The 2 worked around the campsite getting their dinner ready. There was very little conversation. After they finished eating, Sean voiced the question they both had been thinking about ever since seeing the eyes. "Do you think there is any chance he is wandering around out there?" Chester cut him off. "No. He's dead." Sean said in a non-accusing tone, "There was no blood. People live from losing their eyes. It isn't a fatal injury. Son, the man is dead. If he were alive we would have found him. He was nowhere around. Whatever attacked him, left the eyes to mess with our heads. And it worked. Just the fact we're talking about it now instead of working out what we are going to do in the morning is proof. What are we going to do? Not like we have any choice. We walk out. We'll be back to what goes for civilization by this time tomorrow or the next day at the latest. I'm pretty sure I can find the way." Suddenly there was a commotion in the darkness just beyond the reach of the campfire's illumination. Next they heard sounds of something big and heavy walking a circle around their campsite. It was careful to stay in the cover of the darkness but it was close enough they could actually hear its wet breathing. The creature was not intimidated by the men or their fire. Unusual for an animal to say the least. Sean had been digging in his backpack. "Aha! I was hoping it was still here and it is." He had found a penlight still in a pocket inside his backpack. They had flashlights but they hadn't been able to find them while gathering firewood back when they still had some light from the day. Getting the firewood together was the most important way to spend the little time they had before darkness took over. After getting the fire going and then fixing something to eat there was finally time for things like digging around for a light of some kind. Sean flicked on the pen light and shined it around their perimeter trying to see whatever it was that was circling their campsite. It was not there. Nothing. Whatever it was the thing was fast, smart and it didn't seem to be giving up. It just moved out further away with its circle. Penlights don't penetrate the darkness very far. Every once in a while they would get a drift of the odor of whatever was out there. It stunk. A foul combination of that wild odor you get when you first walk into a pet store with the sour dank stench of swamp mud and maybe a hint of fish as well. Now that they had the penlight, they would turn it on at various points trying to catch sight of the creature that was walking around their campsite. More to the point was that by having the penlight to threaten to turn on at any time, they were able to keep the creature a bit further away from them than otherwise. Still, they continued to hear its wet breathing, which might have been the sound you'd expect to hear a horse make while breathing. The whole circumstance was so surreal that it would have been funny if not for the fact that their guide was dead, and who could forget those eyeballs sitting atop the stump, which to their knowledge were still on top the stump watching everything unfold. When they arrived back to the scattered camp, there was barely time to gather firewood before the night was completely dark, which had been paramount because they knew they were going to have to spend the night there where their guide had been killed. Suddenly, from a distance not too far away, the night's silence was broke by a blood-curdling howl that sounded like it might have been born from a set of lungs big enough to support a full-grown horse. Then, to drive the point home, the darkness hid whatever was crashing through the underbrush, sounding like it was coming right at the men and then would fall off at the last second. This went on all night. Sometimes it would be joined with the sounds of limbs breaking. Big limbs. Chester held the rifle in his lap, but he refrained from pointing it into the dark night for several reasons. The biggest being that he didn't want the thing that was out there, looking in at them with the fire so it could see them, to know an important fact. They could not see it. But did it know they couldn't see it? He did not want to give away the fact they were completely blind. It would give any intelligent opponent the knowledge that they could attack from any direction out of the darkness, and that the two men would not have time to react before they were compromised. By keeping the rifle in his lap but not pointing it out into the darkness, it sent the message that they could at any time be pointing the rifle at what was out there. That he wasn't worried, and that he felt confident his rifle could take down whatever he shot. However, if Chester was standing up and pointing the gun and he happened to guess the wrong direction to have it pointed, the opposition was going to know that they had no idea where to point it. That would be a very bad bit of information to get out. So, as tempted as Chester was to point the rifle every time they heard something come crashing at them, he forced himself to stay cool and keep the rifle ready, but never pointed. Sean was no fool either. He kept a big piece of firewood that had one end burning, right where he could pull it out of the fire and use it as a weapon. He even pulled it out and waved it around every once in a while to demonstrate they had more than just one way to protect themselves. Neither father nor son got any sleep the entire night. When morning arrived, they looked around and were able to find most their stuff that had been lost in the last minutes of sunlight the night before. Both their flashlights were located. Some of their fishing supplies. A brown paper sack was found, which they decided to use to transport what was left of their guide. When they walked over to retrieve the eyeballs, they noticed something new had been added to the macabre site. Laid in between the eyeballs, the man's tongue had been laid. It had obviously been yanked, not cut, from the man's body. This left the image in their minds, which they greatly wanted to avoid. It was impossible to stop imagining, however, that Cheddar was out there somewhere, blind, unable to scream for help. It was a brutal thought, made worse by the fact they were running away like cowards. Still, to be fair, they were not the guides. The man had walked them straight into a whole can of whoop-ass that they did not desire to encounter. In the end, self-preservation won out, and they did not bring up the terrible thoughts. They quickly gathered the body parts into the brown paper sack and stored it away in their pack. Then it was time to go. For the first couple hours things went very smoothly. Even better was that Sean was recognizing the land points which had stood out on their walk into the area, which meant that Chester was indeed remembering correctly the trail they needed to go in order to get back to their vehicle. Naturally, if they were to come across a mount, they would report the death of their guide. Going into their third hour of hiking out of their location, the two men again encountered intimidation tactics. As they made their way through the landscape, they would encounter the sound of something coming through the underbrush at them, only to have it fall away at the last second before they would expect something to come into view out of the forest. Since it was daytime, there was no cause to hide pointing the gun, therefore Sean, who was carrying the gun, always had the rifle pointed in the direction which the intimidating sounds would come. However, time after time nothing would end up coming into view. The intimidation increased the further out of the area the men went, which meant they were either headed for an even more increased version of what they were enduring, or that the creature was seeing they were almost gone and it was increasing its intimidations in order to push the men completely out of the area. similar to the way one might increase their pushing power when they saw there was just a small distance left to cover. Perhaps putting all they had left into that last push, knowing it was a sound strategy because success was almost inevitable at that point, so why not use up what gas you had left to get there quicker? Chester and Sean discussed this as they continued to make their way out of the area. They decided all they could do was to be ultra-ready for any surprise attack. The day was just one rush through the brush, as Chester and Sean began to call it, after another one. Along about mid-afternoon, the two men got further motivation to not slow down. They stopped to catch their breath, and suddenly, out of the distance of sight of seeing what had thrown it, came what was left of their guide's head. The empty-eyed, earless, and most the hair plucked out of it, head came rolling up to them, with the neck clearly showing it had been literally twisted off the man's body, because it had a sort of tail where once the neck had attached to a body, that now was just a grotesque twisted piece of flesh. Both men jumped to their feet. Chester gave the order to go, so the two men quickly left the area, and they kept moving for about 3 miles before Chester had to have a break. They chose an area where it would not be easily approached with any further body parts being thrown in at their feet. Onwards they hiked, and finally they came to an area where there was some high ground that normally they would have hiked around, but Chester had an idea. They climbed up to where they had basically the highest point within view. What had appealed to Chester was when he saw that up there were some rocks and boulders which looked small enough to allow them to be picked up and either thrown or rolled down the hill. He planned on using them to discourage anything following them if they got up there, and with such an exceptional view were able to spot something following them. They could send down rocks as discouragement. Plus the rifle was also an option, which, the way they saw it, was not out of the question as being used now that they knew what was stalking them had killed Cheddar, their guide. The two men sat there from their high ground vantage point and searched the vista for any sign of movement. Sean searched using his eyesight, while Chester was looking down the barrel of the rifle using the scope to scan the distance. Suddenly he gripped the gun like he was going to fire it, and then he dropped it from the firing position and held it against his chest. Sean asked, "What is it?" "2 of them. There's 2 of them. Who knows? Maybe nowhere. Why didn't you take the shot?" Sean wanted to know. "Which one killed Cheddar? Did either of them?" "We don't know anything for sure." "Yeah, we have a good idea." The thing that kept going through my mind was, what if these 2 were innocent? Sent to escort us out of the area without getting any further trouble. Or even if one is guilty of killing Cheddar, does the other one deserve to die also? They're animals. Are they? I suppose what you say is possible. That maybe those 2 are like the police, and while others took the killer to their version of jail, these 2 are assigned to getting us out of the woods without further injury or death. Chester shook his head in agreement. "But if I were a betting man, I would be betting that either one of the 2 creatures you saw through your scope would have pulled the trigger if the 2 of you were swapped." Chester shook his head in agreement again. Then he said, "Yeah, that would seem to be the even money wager. We're only about 2, maybe 3 hours from getting out of these woods. Sean, I think I would have you place our bet on us. Take the big long shot payoff. What do you think?" "Sounds good, Dad. Let's get down from here and get moving. We've got at least 5 or 6 football fields head start on them, assuming there aren't more ahead of us." Chester and Sean climbed down from their perch. They hustled as best as possible to continue onward in direction of their vehicle, which was parked off the side of a seldom traveled dirt and gravel road. Everything seemed to come together at one time. First the sun had been setting, and now complete darkness was at most an hour away, and in 30 minutes things were going to have a lot of long, dark shadows capable of hiding anything. The two men were quickly coming to the spot where they had parked their vehicle, and finally whatever was stalking them had now come in close enough that Chester and Sean could hear them talking. It greatly reminded both men of a dog they had when Sean was a youngster. It was a collie that thought it could talk. When it would go into a sentence, it was much like when Scooby-Doo would try to talk. Only instead of every word beginning with the letter R, this language seemed like every word started with the letter G. Their conversation or language, the two men didn't know which, seemed to hold to a monotone which was confusing since it gave no impression whether the stalkers were excited or perhaps experiencing some other emotion. Imagine they sounded something like if you said, "Gare," over and over and over. A language more of grunts than actual syllables being spoke. Chester and Sean were further motivated to keep moving. They were getting so close. Then out of the complete unexpected direction of where they were headed, came an authoritative voice which demanded they stop where they were at and for the one man to disarm by laying down his rifle. Then a bright light was flicked on, blinding Chester and Sean since they had not been using any sort of light. Using an already risen hand, Chester blocked out the glare of the bright light to see that it was a Mountie that held the bright light. Both men let go a sigh of relief. A short while later they were at the Mounties rover where he called in for backup. Chester and Sean stayed and answered all the questions put to them about what had happened. When asked about seeing the creatures through his scope, Chester responded that he almost took the shot, but then he saw the second creature come into view of his scope, which caused him to drop the gun down and not fire. Chester and Sean were told to stay in Canada for a couple days while the Mounties sent out a search party for the remains, of Cheddar, their guide. When they were contacted by the Mountie in charge of their case, he told them the search party had indeed found Cheddar's head and that they also encountered some sort of creatures that also used the same intimidation strategies as Chester and Sean had described. However, nothing ever came of it and the search party was able to leave the area without an escalation of circumstances. Chester and Sean were not contacted again about the matter. They spend their vacations these days, doing things which do not involve hiking into the wilderness. Thank you for visiting. Please subscribe, it is appreciated and needless to say really helps upstarts like this one. Godspeed to all.